Alistair Robertson, chairman of Taylor's Port, continues the family tradition. His experience spans 44 years. Today is our chance to talk to the man and enjoy the lasting qualities of his wine.
But nobody sat down. I didn't sit down with anybody and they developed my palate. It isn't a thing like that. I think it's A, to start with, you've got to be interested enough and enjoy it and love it. And B, it is then, in my case, obviously being born into the port trade. I was brought up with my uncle Dick Yateman, for instance, his house, even back at school holidays, having a glass of port. When he had a vintage port, or every night he had a glass of 20-year Tawny, but in between the better nights we had a vintage. So I was brought up to enjoy it and love it.
In the creation of Taylor's vintage port, how much of its greatness is concerned with nurture and how much with nature?
You make a great wine in the vineyard, and the same thing happens obviously with vintage port. Fine wine is made in the vineyard, so the terroir, the place, is fundamental. I mean, what makes Taylor's is the Quinta de Vargellas and Terra. I think this continuity of making it, in the case of port, the same way, getting the best out of it. Vintage port only has 3 days of fermentation. The third day, you stop it by adding your wine alcohols, kills the yeast and you create port. And that happens about the third night. Portuguese always say babies and port always seem to happen in the middle of the night because you've got to do it at that moment. Vintage port, for our top port, certainly in our cases, all our top quintas, we make by foot. Now why? It's because treading it by foot, you're moving the skins in the wine, and you're extracting all the flavors. A vintage time is 8 hours a day picking. And then you have wonderful meals, and then you go down and tread for 4 hours, which you get double pay for. And in that 4 hours, the first 2 hours, you cut left, right, across the cigar. Really, you're the crusher to break up the skin. And then the music starts. And the first song is Now My Feet Are My Own, because you can then dance around rather than march around. And then you have another 2 hours of dancing around when you're invited to dance if you want. Those hours of treading are fundamental to extracting the flavours.
So that is the foot of humanity. What about the hand of humanity? Is the picking process in your vineyards for Vargellas that much more precise?
You're picking much more precisely at the moment of best ripeness. That best ripeness, which is the balance of the acidity in the sugar. And that does mean you come out to Vargellas or Terra, where you will see, and our winemakers, each day you're moving around the vineyard. It isn't, in the old days you started like that, went across, but now you're moving around the vineyard as the perfect moment, the best moment comes about.
What about the flair of humanity?
The flair comes in, if you like, is in the tasting, is in the blend. Again, any great wine, it is in the blend. The blends that have to make up vintage Taylor will come from this part and that part of Vargellas and this part and that part of Terra. And that makes the blend. Indeed, our viticulturist, we've got a marvellous viticulturist, on his map, he has the different parts of the Quinta. He will have the production, the yield from that bit of the vineyard, and then he will have to which blend it goes. So he's able to see what's happening to that bit of vineyard. So your blenders are then putting the blend together after the second vineyard, and then the other partners and directors will come in and you decide at the end of the second year whether you are going to declare a vintage or not.
In years that you do not declare a classic vintage, you will produce a single Quinta vintage as your primary label. Can you tell us how Quinta de Vargellas vintage differs in content, say, from a classic vintage port?
But the vintage year would have more tannin, more structure, more backbone, etc. The Vargellas, which hasn't quite achieved that, has slightly less, and therefore is coming around a bit quicker. Instead of in 20 years, it's coming around 12, 15 years. And therefore, that's our great label, Quinta de Vargellas, and that's been an enormous success.
What is your favourite classic vintage of Taylor's?
45 is an amazing wine. So I think if I have a good supply of 45. But that is, one can't unfortunately have 45 all the time. I think what I'm waiting for is the 92 and the 94, which are wonderful wines. And there's, the thing is, are they going to be the next 45s? I don't know, I'll live long enough to see that, but they are fabulous wines. We declared 1992, and Mr. Parker was kind enough to give it 100 points. So it was it is a fabulous wine. And at the tasting, you can see it's got all the structure of the body. Declared vintage years are just great. And in between, you have to pick your specials.
Serena Sutcliffe said of Taylor's vintage port, "It reminds me of Lafite Rothschild. Over the centuries that Lafite methods, practices and even the grape varieties changed, and yet the wine remains defiantly Lafite. Taylor's has lived through evolution and revolution, both viticultural and political, and the wine has remained triumphantly Taylor's." Could you comment on what it is that makes Taylor's so outstanding?
It's a continuity of looking for the same structure for the same wines. If you're going to get on with a great wine in the family, it's the involvement of family too, in the sense of maintaining the things that make that wine. You're maintaining what nature is actually producing there in the best possible way. Your involvement is actually getting the best out of it, in the sense of the right moment to pick it, the best moment to pick it, the best way of extracting it, in the sense the quality of the wine, in the sense of making it, and then your big decision is also afterwards in putting the wines together to make your final blend.
Do you love the ritual of opening, decanting, serving, passing the port?
Decanting can sound, put people off. It's actually a perfectly straightforward thing to do. Port, of course, has more ritual, if you want it, than anything else, because you're sitting around after a splendid dinner. Otherwise it isn't a splendid dinner. You're sitting around with vintage port being passed around, and then you've got the ritual of it being passed around to the left, which is a wonderful tradition. Why does port go to the left, Port and start. Well, why does it go left? Well, there are lots of lovely stories, but probably the most sensible one is in the Navy. Port can't go to starboard. Port goes to port. Port's got to go to the left. Hence, port goes around. Now, in any other wine, you haven't got that. Port's got that. And I think the younger people are going in, have found this rather fun. And you get all sorts of people saying, pass the port, and then you go...
There's the Bishop of Norwich story.
Oh, the Bishop of Norwich. Well, that's quite good if somebody sits on the port instead of screaming at them. Do you know the Bishop of Norwich? Why? Well, he's an awfully nice man, but he always forgot to pass the port.
Tell me about how important the time difference between opening a bottle of port, decanting a bottle of port, and serving a bottle of port.
Yeah, well, like any fine wine, it does need, and it so often is you open it too late. It's better to open much earlier. And even vintage port, of course, being that extra strength, it keeps very well, even better than table wine after opening. But vintage port, for the older ones, we always say a couple of hours, but in fact, actually, if you can give it more, so much the better, unless you're going back to the pre-war. But if you can open it, very often actually, if you can open it in the morning for a dinner, it gives it all up. Because so often you pour out a vintage port, or like a fine wine, and it opens up as you're there. And so often people will say, like having a great table wine open too late, and by the end of the meal, you'll say, oh, this is wonderful, because it's opened up. And it's such a pity not to have opened up before.
You were born on Friday the 13th of August 1937. Has it brought bad luck?
No, but I've had to drink a lot of vintage port to be able to counterbalance it. Anybody born on Friday the 13th should drink a lot of good vintage port. Only way to survive.
Alistair and Gillian, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, especially also you extracting a bottle of Taylor's 1963 from your own cellar. It was an absolute joy, quite magical. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely lovely, thank you.
Yes.